God in heaven, we thank you for the blessed Sabbath. We thank you for the rest we've been able to have. We ask as we review these subjects that you may especially grant us eyesight to understand the principles and trace the thread from the very beginning to where we are now to understand what's to come in the future. We thank you for your love and your watch over us through this past week. May you continue to be with us as we study this day. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you. I have a couple of questions before we start. Just going back to some things that I think it was in Christine's prayer, but I thought I'd ask, as we talked about it last night, that our work is to set up the kingdom of God, right? What is God's kingdom?
Yeah, I'm looking forward to finding out what that looks like. I'm hoping that Elder Tess is working towards that. Do we know?
I was going to ask you guys' thoughts on it. So anybody else? What is God's kingdom?
Well, we know it has something to do with equality.
Mm-hmm.
No domination, no dominated, no oppressed, no killing, no raping. And like Elder Parminder mentioned, there will probably be some bumps along the way, even in God's kingdom, because we're still learning. So not everything's going to be peachy, cozy, and rosy, but there will be harmony because there will be equality. That's part of it anyways.
Susan asked, isn't it within our hearts? Okay, another question about Noah's Ark. What did Noah's Ark represent?
Didn't it represent God's kingdom? Or not?
We're looking for people's thoughts.
I know it represented making a choice in a mindset and believing in God.
From a literal standpoint, it was a place to be saved through the storm.
Right. It was a refuge.
Right. Right. Oh, a refuge. Wow, that's good.
I don't think that was me, whoever that noise was. No, I don't think it was me. I don't know if you heard it, but
I think it was me.
Oh, it was you. Okay. I think it was me. So it's a refuge. It's could we say it represents salvation?
Yeah.
Place for salvation. I was just thinking last night's study and then through Christine's prayer about setting up God's kingdom. The kingdom is within us. It's in John 17 when Jesus prayed. He finished the work. Jesus finished the work. And Jesus reflected the image of God. He was God manifest in the flesh. He represented the kingdom of God on earth. He represented God to the people. And it was up to the people to want to be a part of that kingdom or not. So also in that prayer was that we would be one, like Jesus was one with God. So in setting it up, it's not a building. Doesn't it mean setting ourselves up to reflect the image and character of God? That's what I think.
That's what I see.
Anybody else? Susan,
Right.
you read what Susan
We're his
wrote.
counterpart.
Yeah.
And, I thought about the, I can't remember exactly how many there were, but, in the days of the ancient Israel, right, God set up cities of refuge,
Hmm.
cities of safety.
Where they got to flee to from the slayer.
Yes.
And they were going to be, if I remember, I've always thought about that with the cities of refuge, that the Sabbath was like a city of refuge. I don't know if that's correct or not, but it seems that God's kingdom is that city of refuge, and it's set up in various parts of the world the way we're scattered about, right?
Right. Yeah.
And Susan wrote, Christ formed within the hope of glory is the kingdom within us that hopefully shines out of us. Is that why we're scattered apart? So we are refugees. We are refuges set apart for those who will come into the truth.
The way I kind of see it is that because of the internet, right? It's not just our location, but our languages, right? Because each of the different countries, they have different languages, so people can be able to reach out to and understand the message in their language online.
So when Jesus said, I finished the work you gave me, and people were able to see, don't you know that when you've seen me, you've seen God? Well, what does that mean about us? What does finishing the work look like?
Looking like Christ.
That's what I think. So just a couple thoughts on those.
Which goes back to letting go of all that baggage, because all that baggage keeps us from looking like Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Because what did he have? He walked around with nothing. He walked around from here to there with just himself, right? He didn't carry around a lot of baggage. Well, we also mean baggage and thought and stuff, but he was in such good communication with God that he didn't have that extra baggage, that misunderstandings that we have. But Christ, it was so simple,
So is the kingdom of God, is it us individually and as a movement perfectly reflecting God manifest in the flesh? Would that be why in Joel 2:32 it says that in that day all that call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved, for salvation is in the remnant in whom God has called? I mean, those are questions I've always thought about. Anybody else before we keep moving? So Christina and I are both going to touch on the presentations that she did that talks about good advice. And I was thinking about that in lines of what we're looking at too, that I don't know how to ask this question other than to say it to where the answer will be obvious. Does God force anything?
It has to be a choice within our own hearts, because he will not force it, because he wants heaven to be harmonious. If he's forcing someone to do something and they end up in heaven, they won't be happy there. He's merciful by not forcing us to choose something we wouldn't want.
So does he, this is another hard one too, I think, because I don't know that I understand thoroughly either, but is God going to just say, do this, do that? Like a dictator?
Well, there's when we talk about dictatorship and forcing, there is one parable that I don't understand how that fits into God's character, and that's the parable of Jonah. So I don't know how to explain that. I mean, that was pretty forceful, I would say. So I don't know how to reconcile that. And that's about the only part I have trouble with when it comes to forcing or having the choice. Because to me, he didn't have much of a choice but to go to Nineveh. So, like I said, maybe in a critical juncture, maybe he would force. I don't know.
I was looking at what Troy said. Let me scroll back up a little bit. We're sometimes brought into circumstances where we are forced to make a choice. And I kind of thought about that when he said that, because I won't go into the details of parts of my past, but I remember a few different places where it seemed like God sat me down and said, well, Elaine, I've shown you. What are you going to choose? And, they were tough choices. And I said, I don't have any choice but to go forward. So I made the choice to continue going forward, and that meant leaving behind, difficult things. And, but we move forward. So yeah, I guess in a way those choices, we are forced to a place where, and that's the test. And wouldn't that be the testing periods? Each test, it's like, okay, I've shown you, I've given you I've brought down an angel to give you a message. I've increased the knowledge. I've formalized it. Now I'm going to test you. What are you going to do? And so I was just thinking about that on the subject of good advice. Because he gives us good advice. He doesn't tell us what to do. He gives us good advice. No one's going to come down and say, you have to do this, this, and this, and this, and this. I'm just giving you good advice. But what is that good advice? What does it represent?
Life.
Or
Yeah.
life or death. And if we don't see that by now, we ought to be able to see that by now on this journey, that good advice. And this is 2020 where she was talking about it. And she was talking about it after, if I remember correctly, after Elder Parmenter talked about it.
She, in my presentation, she mentions that he had already talked about it.
Yeah, he had already talked about it. And go ahead.
That she just expounds on it.
Yeah. So good advice is the messages that we're given, and the lines, the cords that we're to hold on to, are to direct our path. And they are what tell us how to behave. And that's how she says it. That's the way she words it in the presentations, is that they tell us how to behave. But it's up to us to choose to behave according to how the lines direct us. So I was just, some thoughts on that before we go in. So I'll open it up, and I'll remember to turn off the whatever it is that makes you see black on the screen.
And I guess Jonah could have kept running. It would have been difficult. He could have kept running, or he could have just stayed in the well. It does seem forced, but he could have made other choices. It's a hard one to grasp. It's very visual.
Were you going to say something, Luke?
Yeah, only just when we think of like force, right? God's trying to get us to vote for him, right? So
Campaign.
I guess the good advice is part of his election campaign, because I mean we can't do anything about election day. That's coming, right? That's set, and we all know it's going to happen. And it's just a matter of who whose advice we're going to take, how we're going to, who we're going to tick on our ballot form. You know, we can take Satan's advice, and freedom looks very appealing, but I think the way that ends up is on Satan's side, in terms of like the whole great controversy, you end up back in a dictatorship. So it sounds like freedom, because that's what the right's doing. Like America's transforming progressively back to a dictatorship from a republic. So yeah, it's not propaganda, I guess, but you know, like all the pamphlets that the people give out you to vote for them, and they put up signs, things like that. That's what God's doing to us through you know, the midnight cry and all these messages, to try and get us to understand who he actually is, because you don't necessarily want to vote for someone when you don't know what they're about, do you? So he's been correcting our misunderstandings of his character, so we can go, oh, that's actually what God's like. So, you know, that's who I want to vote for, not for, you know, what I thought was right, which was freedom to do whatever. So that's all I had to say.
In that line, Satan's been having a smear campaign against God all this time, telling everybody that he hates people who are, you know, gay and lesbian, bisexual and trans and all that. He's been saying that God hates all that, but in reality, God's trying to correct that and let everyone know that there's no gender, and he loves everyone equally, and he wants everyone to understand that. That's awesome.
Yeah, exactly. I like that, Christine.
Good to bring the campaign into it.
Yeah,
Really good to bring the campaign in.
because that's where it all started, that information, you know, and with Satan trying to get people on his side, you know, through information campaign. That's the way it all started. So that's a good way to put it.
And when you look at all the trees of the garden, and then the one tree that you couldn't eat from, that one tree represents freedom no matter what. So to choose, you know, maybe you're a person that thinks, well, I don't cause harm to others, and I have my rights, and I have the right to my freedom. But by choosing that kingdom, you choose that it's okay to have freedom at the expense of others. Even if you think that you're not going to go cause harm to anybody else. You're still choosing a kingdom that stands for freedom to the point of hurting others.
Right, because as I just drew a blank. You support it either with your hand or with your mind. So even though you may not be directly harming others, with your mind, you're still supporting by choosing that, choosing freedom.
I was thinking about that verse, and I want to say it's in Romans, but I think it's in Romans, that those who have pleasure in, if maybe somebody can help me remember it, because I think it talks about that same concept, even though you don't do it, but you take pleasure in those that do, something along those lines. I'm drawing a blanket where that's at.
In Romans, they take pleasure in those that do those things. I'm just thinking maybe Romans 1, did it have to do with that whole thing that's in Romans 1?
Yeah,
that's what I'm remembering.
That's what I think so too. But I don't know if that's the right application here. I was just kind of thinking about that's, you know, anybody that thinks they can dabble off in the freedom, that side of freedom, that's what that side of freedom represents. And God's given us good advice, and as you guys both said, given us a great propaganda parable here, visual of the campaigning between Satan's kingdom and God's kingdom. So maybe hold on to the cords and understand what the cords are to hold on to.
Luke put the verse in the chat.
Who, knowing the judgment of God, that they which commit such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but have pleasure in them that do them. I don't know if that's the right application, but that was what was going through my head.
One thing in the if you go back to the Garden of Eden and you look visually at everything, right? And you've got all of this garden, all of these trees that God says we can do. And there's one that he says don't do. And if we do that one, look what it limited the whole thing by choosing that one. So taking that freedom where you think, oh, I have the freedom to do everything, and you end up completely outside the garden. Whereas having limiting our freedoms to what he did give us. So freedom with restrictions open up the entire garden. So we basically have more freedom by choosing freedom with limitations than freedom to do whatever we want, if that makes sense. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
And that freedom is freedom for me, but oppression for you.
Yes, exactly. Mm-hmm.
Well, maybe hear good advice and choose wisely. Okay, so let me pull this up. So this one is number 7 from the Canadian Prophecy School, Whitestone Foundation, from back in July. And I don't know that I have questions. This has been a while since I put this one together, and I didn't go back through this one to do any questions in it. So we'll see how we go. So we see the line that was laid out on her vision. So we'll quickly review. We went through the dream of Ellen White, which takes us through a reform line. We overlaid it with our reform line as priests, 1989 here to the second advent. And this small group that's cut out of this larger group. So you've got the Daniel 2 and you got the mountain, and then this small group, the stone that is cut out, if I say that correctly, the stone out of the mountain, and then tracing their journey along this narrowing path. The journey gets more and more difficult. At 9/11, we see cords descend. That's the line upon line. These cords descend are what they must hold on to for balance and security, but they have the earth beneath their feet. So you're holding onto the cords, but you still have the earth beneath your feet. They must systematically let go of all the baggage that they've tried to bring with them, all our wrong understanding, the wrong understanding of the nature of God, the nature of the kingdom, the Apis bull, patriarchy, hierarchy, all of that. They have all that baggage, all the Protestant beliefs, everything that goes along with that, that has to be let go of, all the way down to their shoes and their stockings. And as they go barefoot, their feet started to bleed. Towards the latter rain, the Sunday law time period, that path starts to hurt. Ellen White speaks about seeing the blood of those who have gone before, the blood from their feet, and yet still they made it. Then we come to the chasm here, 2019. This chasm is marking Gethsemane, the cross, the beginning of the time of trouble. We saw that 2019 was the cross. So you have, let's see. This chasm is marking Gethsemane, the cross, the beginning of the time of trouble, and this is the time of trouble. And they have all of a sudden this question: to what are these cords attached? For the previous dispensation and here, in the history of the latter rain, there's just enthusiasm. They shout, "We have hold from above." They don't need to question what those cords are attached to. But now in the time of trouble, when they must let go of all the pathway, when they must wrap their arms around those cords and trust only in those cords, now comes the question: what are the cords attached to? We've been trying to review the cords that we've been given, just a few of them. We know we are in Jacob's time of trouble. This is marking Jacob's time of trouble. Elder Parminder has spoken extensively about Jacob's time of trouble in the previous months. And why does Jacob hurt? Because he's fighting the angel. He's held on to the same sin that he had before And because he's held on to that sin and his angel has come to convince him of that, he sees this angel as an enemy and they begin to fight. It's the fact that he is fighting against the angel that makes his time of trouble. He should not have been fighting against the work of the angel. When you think about the Desire of Ages study that we were going through this morning, how you come up with disappointment and discouragement and unbelief and fighting against the angel. That lines up with the experience of the disciples after the cross, still holding on to the sin that they were meant to have put away. And she went through these lines, noting that Jacob's time of trouble being from the close of probation to the second advent, where there's no earthly support, and lined it up with the various different dispensations. And Christ as Melchizedek, where we have the baptism marked at 2019, and also you have the cross marked at 2019. And those are in another study. If anybody has questions, we can send out some of those studies on to show how that lines up. And we've been through it a few times. And then lined up with, it's this chasm from 2019 to second advent. And who holds the cords from midnight to the midnight cry is Acts 27. And then you have October 22nd. We're on this walk here and going through Acts 27. So that was a brief review and a poor review, so forgive me. And if we need to go back through that, those studies are out there as well. So then we place the two dispensations that we were in from the history of the time of the 40 days after the cross and the 40 days after the baptism, right here, what we just kind of went through. So those 40 days tell us the experience of this movement from the close of probation, 2019, to that increase of knowledge. That's the middle line. So the close of probation would be 2019. The increase of knowledge from 2019 to close of probation to when we received the increase of knowledge. We reviewed Acts 27. We are still in the history when the Sunday law is opening up. It is far from completed. When you go to the line of the 144,000, we understand that 2019 is this increase of knowledge. When you go look at on the line of the 144,000 from 9/11 to the Sunday law, then 2019 is the increase of knowledge, and 2021 was the formalization. So we are still in the history when the Sunday law is opening up. It is far from completed. Then we began to look at one of the lines, the chief line we take from Millerite history, and we are after October 22nd, 1844. Now I want to finish this discussion on revolutions, and then I want us to look at our key reform lines, the end of ancient Israel and the beginning of modern Israel. So we've been discussing revolutions, and we showed how we came to study the revolutions. And we saw last night that the revolutions come in two parts. We also saw that the revolutions bring us to November 9, brought us to dictators. The revolutions brought us to dictatorship, also brought us impeachment, but not on November 9. We went through last night and saw the war on, this is war on the Western Front. The revolutions and the revolution and the counter-revolution is the war on the Western Front, separate from the Battle of Raphia, that is the Eastern Front over spheres of influence. So this study gave us this pattern, a revolution from 9/11 to 2019, November 9, 2019, with a midpoint of 2014, where you see one side begin to have victory over the other, and that's where we talked about last night. Or maybe ask somebody, remind us again, who did the work in 2014, or what were the three things that were done in 2014 that marked that turning point?
The purging of the Republican Party?
Yes.
Lobby case?
Say that again.
The Hobby Lobby case?
Okay, that's two.
It had to do with the judges, the Supreme Court, blocking filling the Supreme Court judges, or not just the Supreme Court, but the judges from Mitch McConnell.
Yeah, the lower courts.
The lower courts, right?
setting up the place that when the person that they're gonna, the dictator that they want to put in place is going to have all these open judge appointments to make.
Right. It was mostly the lower courts, but there was one spot on the Supreme Court too.
Right.
Right.
So we can see that 2014, it's a turning point. November 9, 2019 marks the end of that revolution. So that was the end of the revolution. We saw that 2016, we talked about that last night, that is Trump a dictator in 2016? I think we all agreed, yes. We saw that there, what she's lining up is that there are four steps in this progression towards a dictatorship. You see the work that they've done in 2014 to prepare, and then 2016, and then 2019 is marking the end of this revolution. And what distinguished him to be, what distinguished the dictatorship here in 2019? Not November 9, but 2019. What distinguished the dictatorship?
Trump became more powerful.
What caused it? What caused it?
Because of the impeachment, that he was not, well, he was impeached, but he wasn't outed.
Right, right. Which gave him more power.
Exactly.
Less restraint and more power. Okay. So 2020 marks the beginning of the counter-revolution. And what was this date and what was the event that marks the counter-revolution?
It was George Floyd on May 25th.
Right. So beginning the counter-revolution, and we saw that when you take the spirit of prophecy of close of probation to second advent, the repeating patterns show us that there's an increase of knowledge and a formalization. There's two little waymarks, and there's the waymark of the death decree. And so if this were 2019 or 2021 right here, so you have, and we did not have these dates back here yet, or this middle one anyways. So you have this dictatorship. Now you have the counter-revolution set up, marked by the death of George Floyd. And then what followed the death of George Floyd that showed the death decree?
The death of four more prominent people.
Correct. Anybody, you remember any of them?
Let's see, there's Helen Reddy, RBG, John Lewis, and something, Chadwick Boseman.
And what did they represent?
See, Helen Reddy represented feminism. RBG represented dissent. John Lewis represented voice of conscience. And Chadwick Boseman, race.
Yeah. So you have race and women's rights, equality, wrapped up into all of it. So with the death of John Lewis, you have the death of the voice of conscience in Congress, which he was referred to as. And then with the death of RBG, you have the voice of dissent, which actually Ellen White quotes those, the dissent and voice of conscience, if I remember correctly. So 2020 marks that period there, marks this. And this is July, so May 25th was just a couple of months before. So the beginning of the counter-revolution against the dictatorship that was established, the establishment of the United States is overthrown through, and we get that establishment, you go back to 2016 in the Battle of Ipsus to see, looking at Antigonus and I was going to say Pyrrhus, but it's Demetrius, isn't it? Somebody help me out to make sure I don't mess that up. But you see the battle, yeah, it's Antigonus. Demetrius is his son. What am I missing? But it showed the the Battle of Ipsos showed the death of the establishment coming, or the vote for the establishment, and so the death of the establishment happens. So the United States is overthrown through a revolution from 9/11 to 2019, and in 2020, the counter-revolution begins against this new leadership. We discussed why 9/11 would mark the beginning of a revolution. It's this political polarization that had occurred within the United States. This divide between Democrats and Republicans, but particularly began with the Iraq War. We saw that George Bush went to war even against the UN, and there were three. I know Russia was one of them. I want to say Britain and France, maybe somebody remembers, that voted against what the US was doing. We referenced a number of articles and a YouTube video that discussed that, and I just read one sentence from that review, or I'll just read one sentence from that review. The degree of factual polarization over Iraq and the role of partisan media outlets like Fox News in driving it may have marked the dawn of a new normal. So particularly with the Iraq War, which it was 2003, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. And we know that if we were to back up here, 1996 is where you have Fox News and CNN come on the line. So, so we see Fox News playing a role here. So over the centuries, polarization occurs, but usually after there's a tense issue that they come back to some type of agreement, there can be some semblance of normal. What happened with the rise of 24-hour cable news networks beyond Fox, just that system in general, was a sensationalizing of news that turned it from something that was to educate us into something that was more to entertain us. It made news have to be sensational. So it's the whole package, the whole system of how news is spread now that has done that. But Fox News has been something special. They have taken that sensationalism, that 24-hour news cycle that is entertainment, and turned it into something that is a propaganda machine for the right wing, particularly Protestant, Christian, white, nationalistic right wing of the United States. So once that happened, it was the dawn of a new normal, and you cannot come back to a place of agreement with the other side. This split can only continue to grow. This occurred from 9/11 through the Bush administration, particularly enhanced by the Iraq War. A turning point occurred in 2014, where one side of this equation began to win, and that was the far right. And we mentioned three things that happened in 2014, which I already quizzed you on. That was the blocking of the judges, so that Obama couldn't appoint judges. That was the work of Mitch McConnell. For more information on that, we can watch the Frontline video as well on that. They also began to purge the Republican Party. And who was involved in the work of this work here, of purging the Republican Party?
Steve Miller, Steve Bannon.
Yeah, did you say all three?
Sessions.
In Sessions, yeah.
That's the part.
And that began in that work began in when they got together in 2012 after Obama was elected again and said never again was that going to happen. And then Burwell versus Hobby Lobby, what did we discuss last night? That was. And we have the answers here, so. So it was the beginning of the work begun by Jeff Sessions, Steve Bannon, and Stephen Miller to purge the Republican Party from the inside. Mitch McConnell started to block Obama's judge appointments to the judicial branch, and this was taking over of that branch of the US government by right-wing conservatives. So looking at it since we don't know our end from our beginning, and we're learning our end from our beginning because we're looking back at the beginning to understand more and more. Knowing in 2014, we didn't understand any of what was going on. But when you take these judges and then you look at what we're seeing on the Supreme Court today, you can see how, I don't know the right word to put to describe it, you can see thinking about the Great Controversy quote where she talks about the nation speaks through its, the nation with lamb-like horns, speaks like a dragon, speaks through its legislative and judicial branches. And we can see how that worked, blocking those judges. And I remember, I don't know if it was Elder Tess that said it, she might have, probably did, but I remember seeing it, that Obama wasn't really particularly urgent about appointing judges. I don't know if anybody remembers that he didn't see the urgency in appointing judges. And so McConnell blocks the judges, but then we also know that about a year before it was his last year in office, but plenty of time, that there would be an opening on the Supreme Court. And McConnell also blocked that and claimed that it wasn't right for the president to place a Supreme Court on the judge to place a judge on the Supreme Court with so short a time, and that spot should be reserved for the incoming next president, which is like going to be like a year later, if I remember the timeline. And yet you turn around and see, we talked about it last night, how they rushed Amy Coney Barrett in the last weeks of Trump's presidency. So when you think about it in terms of people, us in this movement and what we know, and people outside this movement witnessing these things, one side is celebrating Roe v. Wade's going to be overturned, and maybe some were out there recognizing the danger that we were in. But I know I certainly wasn't recognizing it. So then we also marked the Supreme Court case, Burwell versus Hobby Lobby, which led, quote, according to Americans United for Separation of Church and State, it opened the door, it was come out of there, it opened the door that could lead to a dangerous reinterpretation of the meaning of religious freedom. It was part of that opening of the door, and it has done that. And RBG wrote a long dissent on that. So leaving behind 9/11, 2014 is a turning point. 2019 is the end of the revolution. We discussed that November 9 was, when we look at the lines that built up that day, we stepped back and considered Raffia. And that's what we looked at last night, was the Battle of Raffia. And I have for many months now asked people to question why they call that Raffia. It's as if that name Raffia trumps every other name you might call that waymark. It just is Raffia. And I wanted to question that because Raffia is one single aspect of a more complex waymark. And last night was the study where she talks about really needing to be able to see, not just on a whiteboard that we see in 2D, but the things that we're trying to understand, the concepts we understand are more like 3D, and we need to be able to see it in 3D. And how she broke down November 9 is not Raffia. Raffia is a period of time that is the battle between the King of the North and the King of the South, which is the battle. And she did go into it being a battle between the North and the South within, but mainly Raffia being the battle over spheres of influence, war on the Eastern Front. World War III, war on the Eastern Front. So I wanted us to question how we look at waymarks. Why do we say 1989 and 9/11? Why do we go from years to days when it suits us, and then from days back to years when that suits us? We have not been precise in how we have handled waymarks, and that's part of the confusion over 2019, because there were those that expected to see November 9 be the impeachment as well, when we went over that last night too. So last year we reinforced the point, watch the external events occurring throughout the year. So instead of focusing on a day, watch the events that throughout, which is what she has now been laying out. When we talked about this, she's been laying out with the work in Ukraine and showing it from the battles of Pyrrhus and showing it from the battles of the King of the North versus the King of the South, and who starts the battle and who the victor is. Watch the external events occurring throughout the year. They particularly started in earnest in March, March being the overthrow of the ISIS caliphate, March being Russian troops in Venezuela. There was this particular intensity that escalated in March that took us through the whole of 2019 in a similar way to what happened in 2014. But then there is also how we describe it as raffia that can be misleading if we're not precise with our terms. So needing to see it all in 3D. So March is where she's marking, watching these external events, but particularly in March. And we did talk about the ISIS caliphate last night, and also the Russian troops in Venezuela, and then went through all the victories that the King of the South had in the what we know to be the Battle of Raffia. And the battle was over spheres of influence. So November 9, this date was not come to by the study of time spans that took us to 2019. For example, impeachment. Impeachment never takes us to November 9. It only takes us to the year 2019. In 1868, Andrew Johnson is impeached. It's a process throughout 1868. He does not get impeached on November 9. When we make application of that, Donald Trump was never expected to be impeached on November 9. What did take us to the day was this study on revolutions. This study on revolutions we discussed is what front in World War III. So World War I and World War II have two fronts. You have the Eastern Front and the Western Front. Eastern Front was Russia versus the United States. Western Front, United States versus the West, and that's World War III. There's two fronts in World War I and World War II. You bring that into World War III, and you see war on the Eastern Front and war on the Western Front. War on the Western Front is Russia versus the United States, and then war on the West, I think I said Western. War on the Eastern Front is Russia versus the United States. War on the Western Front is the United States versus the West, which is the United States. So we all agreed that the study of revolutions is internal. It is civil war, which is the United States against the United States, Western Front. And another point that we saw last night's study where she marked 1865, where you had Lincoln as the one that freed the slaves, and a transition from Lincoln to, well, when you go from Lincoln to count 1865, 151 years later, you got to Obama, who is pro-equality. And then you went from Lincoln, one who freed the slaves, to Johnson, who's pro-slavery. And then in 1868, you see him impeached. And then you go 151 years from there, and you get to 2019, where you now have Trump, who is not for equality. So using the 151 was just more evidence in that as well. And that's in last night's study, if anybody has the notes. So once we had all agreed it was Western Front, we went back to November 9, 1989, and looked at how that is described in Daniel 11:40. And at the time of the end, the king of the north shall come against the king of the south like a whirlwind. This is a battle in 1989 between the Soviet Union, the king of the south, and the United States, which is Eastern Front. But we discussed why you would describe why would you describe 1989 that way? The reason that the Soviet Union fell was because of internal unrest, civil unrest. So it was a civil war on the inside. You didn't see the United States. But one of the reasons you have unrest on the inside is because of the work of the United States. It was a American Voice of Prophecy. Somebody remembers the radio stations that were feeding information into there. I know Christina's here, she knows. And the work that the United States was doing behind the scenes in Russia. So even this unrest that led to the fall of the Berlin Wall was the result of the actions of the King of the North. This civil war, this internal struggle, can still be described as Eastern Front. It was really brought on by this conflict between the two superpowers. When we come to November 9, is it Eastern Front or Western Front? And it's actually both. It's Eastern because who sparked the Civil War or the civil unrest? And that was Russia. It's Western because all you're going to see is internal issues inside America relating to America. So the work that Russia or Putin did, the propaganda, the Internet Research Agency, all of that was the work that actually the United States had done to cause civil unrest in Russia in 1989 for the fall and collapse of the Soviet Union. So Russia has been doing the same, has done the same to America to cause the civil unrest to bring us to this civil war. So there's a strong connection between what happened in 1989 and what Vladimir Putin did inside America. You'll remember we discussed Libya. Libya before 2011, it was a sphere of influence of Russia. Gaddafi was a Russian puppet, if I can put it so black and white. When the CIA had him overthrown and killed, Vladimir Putin lost his sphere of influence. What happened in 2011? He just lost Libya. And in 2011, he watches Arab Spring rise up. Arab Spring is hitting many of the countries that are also in his sphere of influence. It started hitting Syria, for example, and then you have what is also called snow revolutions. 2011, Vladimir Putin announces he's making a return as president, and tens of thousands of Russian people take to the streets in protest. You have all of these events in 2011 that make Vladimir Putin very angry against the United States. And what does he decide to do? Anybody? He's going to do the United States the exact same thing he believes the United States did to the Soviet Union and is doing to him. The United States conducts regime change from the inside. The United States sends in the CIA and overthrows rulers from the inside. He believes the United States was behind the protests in his own country. He believes they were behind what happened in Ukraine through those years. So his response from 2011 to 2014 is to set up Russia. Over a few years, he sets up the Internet Research Agency and begins building up recruiting people to start doing to America what he believed America did to him at the end of the Cold War. He physically watched the fall of the Soviet Union, so he's going to do to America what America did to him. He's going to interfere from the inside. He's looking at 1989. He blamed the United States. He knew that that civil unrest was the result of the Cold War, and he's taken those tactics, and that is what he has done against the United States in the last 8 to 9 years. So he's looking at back pre-1989, what built up to 1989 and the collapse of the Soviet Union. He sees the work that the United States did, their involvement in bringing the civil unrest within Russia that brought about the collapse. And so in 2011, he begins to set up Russia and to do the same thing in America that what America did to the Soviet Union. So these two dates, what's happening in America and what happened inside the Soviet Union in 1989, also have a direct link. But the Battle of Raphia itself was not something internal that happened in the Seleucid Empire or the Ptolemaic Empire. It wasn't civil unrest in those countries. It was a fight over Kol Syria, that middle strategic piece of land that they were fighting over. So we went through that last night and looked through all the maps and saw the fight being over Kol Syria with with Iran and Saudi Arabia being mortal enemies. And we saw that Russia supported Iran and Syria, and we saw that the United States supported allies with Saudi Arabia and also Qatar And the issue was over building a what do you call it, an oil pipeline, an oil pipeline. And that to go through Syria, Syria said no, because they're supported by Iran and Russia. So then Iran wants to build a pipeline and go through Syria, and Syria says yes. So this affects the economy of Russia and the benefit that they would receive by being able to secure the trying to think of the right words to say, that they are being the ones that are supplying the energy resources to Europe, which builds power for Russia. Okay, so when we talk about Raffia, and we're waiting for November 9 for Raffia, that's where we would start to get into trouble. Because if you guys remember, I mean, I know a lot of us were looking at November 9 as being Raffia, just the same as we were waiting for some date to come about with Panium, but it wasn't about the date. It was about the year and the battle over the spheres of influence. So we're waiting for November 9 for Raffia, and that's where we would start to get into trouble. Raffia was a fight over spheres of influence. It's not limited to one territory like it was when the world was this small. Ptolemy and Seleucus were never going to fight over Venezuela. They don't even know that it exists. And now this battle is worldwide, and we discussed yesterday this Raffia, this fight over spheres of influence. You have Libya, we went through Libya, we went through Yemen and Syria last night, and Venezuela, and then there are others, and then obviously there's Ukraine. And they're some of the key ones that we discussed. And then we looked at just why they are so strategically important. What was one of the points that we came up with when it came to Libya? Talked about Afghanistan and Ukraine. What was one of the reasons, the big reason that Putin wants Ukraine?
Location, because he didn't want NATO in Ukraine at his underbelly. So,
Yeah.
So close to Russia.
So that he would have a buffer.
Yeah.
So the end of the counter-revolution, when does the Western Front end in World War II? The Western Front ends at the same point that the Eastern Front does. And when does the Eastern Front end? So it ends at the Eastern and Western both end at the same time, and they end at Panium. So the end of war on the Western Front within is this war in the United States, the end of the war with the Eastern Front, also Panium. What do we see at 2021 at Panium? What do we know? What do the lines teach us we see at 2021 at Panium? What happens to Russia?
The South starts to lose, or it dies, but it's slowly.
What's the word for that? Actually, it's in the study, so
A deadly wound, but
it's a deadly wound. So let's see. The Eastern Front, it ends at 2021 at Panium. It's an ending, but remember, this is a deadly wound. The conflict continues all the way to the Sunday Law before the King of the South is dead. But the deadly wound is struck there. There won't be a sudden end of polarization as an end of all those issues, but it is the deadly wound, and the pathway is set in concrete. So I was thinking about within as well, the conflict continues all the way to the Sunday Law. And this is as pertaining to the King of the South, the battle between the King of the North and the King of the South. And so if you see these progressive steps, you see what was done in 2014 in order to pave the way for this dictators to come in 2016. And then you have the next progressive step here. You have the impeachment of Donald Trump, but that he's not taken out of office, right? And that establishes him more firmly with less restraint, right? And then you have 2021, another step towards this. So then at the Sunday law, when you have the death of the king of the south, you no longer have two world superpowers. You only have one at the Sunday law.
So that means that it's the king of the north that's rising in power
Yeah,
at this time.
yeah,
The deadly wound of the king of the south is still progressing, and it's progressing on the north side because their power is rising.
and that's one aspect of it, because
Yeah,
the whole other story is Antigonus and Seleucus, but that's another story.
right.
Where does the UN plays in all this?
What's that?
Where does the UN come in?
Where does the UN come in? We're not quite there yet, but I did pull this up, put this in here to show the wars so that we could understand where did World War II, let's see, the Western Front and the Eastern Front, where do they end? So this is the line up here that shows us, and we're not going to go into it, Mary, because I can't do it without notes, especially because I know I'll forget the details. But you have the battle with Antigonus and it's actually in here, sorry, the Battle of Antigonus and Seleucus, the battle over Babylon. So while you have the fall of you're having the fall of the king of the south, you're also dealing with the rise of Seleucus as well. And Seleucus represents who?
The papacy.
The papacy. So there goes that 3D mind boggling to try to keep it all juggled in. So here's our line here though. So particularly marking the Iraq War with the beginning of war on the Eastern Front here of World War I, and then the war on the Eastern Front of World War II, marking here at 2019, and both of them end here at 2021. But we still see this polarization. We're still going to see this all transpire up until the Sunday law, where the king of the south is dead off the scene and the king of the north is the superpower. I know we just reviewed that one, but it wouldn't be a bad idea to review, so much to review, but to review that again, to have that more solid in our minds again too. So, and my mistake in last night's study, it carried over to here because I copied my line. So I'll have to correct this one too, back to 1789. So we'll discuss 2020, where we are now in the counter-revolution. The study of these revolutions is to bring us back to 2020. I'm not sure how we view 1991. I'm not sure if we believe that increase of knowledge in 1991 happened on the exact same day that the Soviet Union crumbled, and I suggest that it did not. I'm not sure how much people are aware of the external events of 2009, that waymark of Concord, whether or not they believe those events happened on the exact same day as Elder Parminder was presenting the 2520 series in Arkansas. I would suggest that they did not. One that I can speak about more clearly is 2016. 2016 is Concord, and you can mark it by a day. It's the victory of Donald Trump in that election. So I don't have that drawn up here on the line, but looking back at 2009, she's referencing the increase of knowledge and the formalization that was in that dispensation. So, so then she's looking at Concord then in 2016 as being between 2014 and 2019. Concord was the increase of knowledge, and then you have formalization. So using the repeating patterns to show that. So in our Sunday law history, when was Concord? And looking at what we have is Boston, Concord, Exeter, and then a shut door. So in our Sunday law history, the external event at Concord is November 8th and 9th of 2016, and that was the election. So she marks it as a day, not just a month and a year, but she marks it with the day, and that was the election. Acts 27 did not open up on November 8th. and November 9th. There isn't a day-to-day correlation between a sudden opening up of that message and the external event. It happened in the later months in 2016. What I want to mark is that internal increase of knowledge when it becomes visible either to an individual or to the movement, though the movement doesn't know it until 2 years later. So we didn't get the study of Acts 27 until here in late 2018. But it actually doesn't become visible to anyone on the same day. What happens is something that occurs within that time frame in the history of Concord. Externally, you have an increase of knowledge. So externally, it's an increase of knowledge. Donald Trump wins that election. So when it comes to 2020, we have our increase of knowledge. And this is a time period internally, but it's also a day externally. And we talked about that day being May 25th. What I want to briefly discuss is the day. It's easy to see that November 8th and 9th, 2016 marked Concord. What were we expecting to see in 2020? One more revolution that we haven't particularly discussed, and that is the American Revolution. And what is 2020 in the American Revolution? And this was talked about at some earlier presentation somewhere briefly. It was the Battle of Concord and Lexington. It was the shot heard around the world. So we know that this waymark is Concord, and we mark the beginning of the American Revolution here. So this is the beginning of the American Revolution, the Battle of Lexington and Concord, and that was the shot heard around the world. What had been occurring was a growing dissatisfaction in the United States back to their British dictators, if you could say it that way. So just to take us back a step, there are two revolutions in American history. They don't each take us over the whole time period, the whole of this period. So you have the American Civil War, the Civil War history, and then you have the American Revolution. Civil War and then Revolution. Combine the two and you have our line of revolutions. 2020 marks the Battle of Lexington and Concord and the beginning of the American Revolution. And I know that that's probably confusing, and I'm not prepared to go into the details of it, but we know that the American Revolution happened actually before historically than the Civil War. But there's studies, I think they're in the Brazil School of Prophets, where she went through that as well a little more thoroughly and laid out the American Revolution there and showed how she got it there. And so the lines are more thorough in those presentations. So there had been discontent growing before, but what happened at the Battle of Concord and Lexington? There was a shot fired, and it's called the shot that was heard around the world. There had been other shots fired. This wasn't just one shot that came suddenly. There were other shots that had been fired previously. There were these other issues or other clashes, but something happened in this battle that was particularly severe, that particularly shocks the people to where they're now ready to unite in Concord and fight against the British. I want to suggest that we've already seen that external waymark in our own history. It's May 25th. And what happened May 25th, that was heard worldwide, that united a group of people already dissatisfied, who had already heard other shots fired, who are now ready to fight against this dictatorship. And that was the death of George Floyd. Those words, "I can't breathe," they went worldwide, and it was the shot heard around the world. So there were already many that were killed by police, many Blacks that were killed by police. And now you have May 25th, George Floyd saying, "I can't breathe." And we all watched on live TV for 9 minutes. I don't, maybe somebody remembers how many seconds it was, but with the knee on his neck and to not be able to breathe. And that went worldwide. And when you think about what we were talking about earlier, about how these external events are meant to bring you to a place of, like a vaccination, like we were talking last night, the study last night talked about the vaccination, that these events should be like a vaccination to care about what is happening to people, to individuals, and what is happening around the world. But based on your perspective, you're going to see it one way or the other. So all of these things prepare people for, are part of their reign, preparing them for the harvest. The impeachment of Donald Trump did not even unify the Democrats, let alone go worldwide. A few people in other cities held up protest signs saying, impeach the president. But the Democrats themselves were split about whether or not to impeach him. They voted to impeach him once it came to that, but this was not the unifying force that this waymark described to us in 2018. What was described to us in 2018 was that something would happen that would unify a group of people into a movement to fight against Donald Trump. After all the things that has been said and done over the last 3.5 years of his presidency, this was the event that unified worldwide against him. Concord externally, meaning to unite, was May 25th. If that's external, what would we expect to see internal? We should begin to expect internally, we're reaching the end of the 40-day period. We're reaching the end of the wilderness experience, and that comes with implications. If you remember the lines that we had over here on the left-hand side, we're coming out of the 40-day period, ending the wilderness, and it comes with implications. So I want to go back to that wilderness experience and make sure we fully understand what that is on a reform line, what it is in application. Before going into a discussion of that wilderness time period, the two 40-day histories, I want to speak about another subject that I've been facing many questions about in the last months, particularly from around the time of the school in Uganda. Elder Parminder taught some things in that school, and everything I say, I agree fully with what he taught. So please don't think that there is error between Elder Parminder and myself. I'm describing another way how I view that subject of what he taught, and what he taught was good advice. I have questions frequently about this from people, and it's phrased in such a way as, I want to do this thing. Am I not allowed to do it, or is that just good advice? And I can't if I want to. It's question mark. So that becomes the way many questions are phrased at this point in time. Since those studies were done, and like the subject of liberalism and conservatism and freedom and religious liberty, those arguments, yet not maliciously, but in whatever, yet not maliciously, but in whatever way they get twisted. So I want to discuss good advice. This is the way good advice works. I want people to take themselves out of their own shoes. Now you're not a member of this movement. Now you are a member of the U.S. Navy, you're a U.S. Navy SEAL. You have a commander up above you. Here's your commander. And you have a lieutenant tasked with organizing you. You're about to go into a mission. You're told before this mission begins how many of you are going to make it through. You're a U.S. Navy SEAL. You're going into a mission. How many are going to survive? About 1 in 6 of you will survive this mission. You're sitting with your comrades, the men that you've trained with this whole time. You look around the room. You know that 1 in 6 of you are going to make it. 5 in your row of seating are going to die on the battlefield. The lieutenant says, the commander gave you some good advice. Do you think you would take that good advice? Do you think he would start to question it? So you know that 5 out of these 6 are going to die on the battlefield. In other words, we're not talking about a physical death. We're talking about when it comes to this message. When you go into the battle, would you say that's his opinion, the commander's opinion, or the lieutenant's opinion? Is that their opinion? I don't need his experience, and I do not need his good advice. This is the way people are using good advice in the movement. So prior to, like we were discussing earlier, Elder Parminder had already given presentations talking about good advice. And so people are asking, am I supposed to do it? It's good advice. What are you going to do? So this is the way people are using good advice in the movement. The commander is God. He sees all. He knows all. We can't get wiser. The commander is God. He tells the lieutenant, I've given good advice to these people. I know it's good advice because I'm God. Tell them to follow this good advice when they're going into this battle. You know that 5 out of 6 of those people of your comrades are going to die. Are you going to take that good advice? Yes. The only reason you would not take that good advice is if you believe it is in fact bad advice. I want to deal with that first directly. It's a straw man argument to say it's good advice, but I don't need to take it. Because what people are doing is not just saying it's good advice for others, but it's not good advice for me. Whether they're doing is what they're doing is saying it's not good advice for me. It isn't for you either, or for you. Let's see. And this was a part that was inaudible. I don't know if you had problems with that as well, Christine, because I noticed with the 2 that I transcribed, there were places where it was hard to pick up the words for some reason or other. So like say that there's, we're sitting here together and some of you are not believing that it's, it's good advice, but I don't have to take it. But you're also talking to others and saying, sharing that it's good advice, but I'm not going to do it. And it has its effect. So if they genuinely believe it is good advice and they knew that there was 5 out of 6 chance the person sitting next to them was going to die on the battlefield, they would turn to them and say, I might not follow it, but I sure hope that you do. The only reason you wouldn't support your comrades in following that good advice is if you believed in your heart it was not good advice. So we need to stop using good advice as an excuse. Just be open about it. Say this is not good advice, this is bad advice. So just be honest with yourself. Can't say that it's good advice, but I'm not going to do it. If it comes from God, it's good advice. So if we genuinely believe that this is good advice, and we realized who gave us that good advice, who's not mortal, but God, when we realized and we looked at Millerite history, at every history, at the stone cut out of the mountain, at the portion of the crowd that begin the pathway, at the people that drop off every time that pathway gets harder, we would not handle good advice lightly. We would see the need to take it ourselves. And even if we decided that we didn't want to follow God's good advice, if we believed it was good advice, we would not turn to our comrade and know the likelihood that they're not going to survive the great controversy final conflict and encourage them to do their own thing, their own way, and go against that good advice. So when someone asks me, must I obey, or is this just good advice, and can I do what I want? My response to that is, it's good advice, but it's life and death. We need to treat good advice as life and death. If you're in a battlefield where there is 4 out of 5 chance you're going to die, then you know that every good advice from your commander who trained you is life and death. And I think that Phil can relate to that. He has in stories of his experience as a fireman. So I hope no one feels that that parable is over dramatizing what this movement is and the danger. I am being more than generous to suggest that 1 out of 5, she switched somewhere in here because someone corrected her and I never quite followed it because she drew out the 6 and all that. So if anybody wants to go back and try to clarify what she's saying between 1 and 6 or 1 and 5. So I'm being more than generous to suggest that 1 out of 5 people who start this journey make it. I'm being more than generous to suggest, and I take that as if she's being generous to say that 1 in 5 will make it, what does that actually mean? What does that imply?
It's going to be less than 1 in 5.
That's what it sounds like to me. So I'm being more than generous to suggest that this is just a mortal death. But what does that mean?
We won't make it into the kingdom of heaven, some of us.
Yeah, it's eternal death. Beyond that, what is the Navy SEALs fighting for? For their own freedom, for their own protection? If they don't make it and the enemy wins, if the enemy takes one of them down and blunts that attack, who suffers? The people that they were designed to protect. So as these ones don't want to take good advice, and they bring about their own eternal destruction, it's going to affect the people that we are designed, raised up to protect. The priests come with a job description. We are to go where? To the church and to the world. Our failures impact them. When we fail, people are lost because of us. Not only does our example, how we behave, how we treat good advice impact our chance of salvation, our own chance of salvation, it impacts those around us that we influence, our colleagues. And it has a flow-on effect of the people that we could have saved, but won't, because we left this movement over good advice. The lieutenant, what's his position? He's just stuck in the middle. Can he stand in front of them and say, the commander told me to give you this good advice, but I think you should do what you want? No, he has to say what the commander told him to. Parables are, this commander is God, the lieutenant is the organization, the leaders of this movement. There is a vast degree of dip between God and between the leaders of this movement. But we are still stuck in the middle. We are still trapped saying the commander said, if you don't want to do it, that's your choice, but it's life and death. And not just mortal death. We can say that when people will at least admit that it is good advice, but people are not going that far. When I say 1 in 5, I'm being very generous. We don't realize the danger of the battle we are in and the lives that are lost because of us. And if you go back to that study of looking at 2019 with Gethsemane on one side and the wilderness on the other side, and contemplating the path and understanding the lives that are the lives of people that are in our hands to do this work. So good advice is life and death. But at the very least, what we are asked to sign up to when we join this movement through the baptismal vows is that at the very least, that advice is good. And what people are doing when they use the argument of good advice is to suggest that it is not actually good advice at all, that it came from the commander as bad advice. So in other words, saying that God gave bad advice. What are people's arguments against the vows of reforms? Because that argument cannot be good advice. The arguments usually used to undermine those vows are the following. One is dispensationalism. That becomes an easy word to throw out. It becomes a major topic of this movement because of what occurred last year when it came to equality. Racial equality and gender equality, nationalism and sexism. So you have dispensationalism, the concept of freedom, literal to spiritual, and a misuse what it means to be liberal. So I want to deal with some of these vows, and I want to deal with them as they should be from the very beginning with appropriate methodology. So what are these vows? We have vows that relate to adornment and jewelry, vows that relate to diet, vows that relate to entertainment. We also have a vow that relates to the Sabbath. I'm going to put that in as well. I want us to start looking at a couple of these subjects with appropriate methodology. But before doing that, I want to remind us of how this movement began. In 1989, the arrival of the first angel. Who was that first angel in human form? We all know that was Elder Jeff. And was he liberal or conservative? We know that he was conservative, socially and morally conservative. So why would God choose a conservative? if the point we are brought to is the point of freedom and liberalism, why does God always choose the conservative? Why, Elder Jeff? So why did he choose a conservative? Why did God choose a conservative?
Because he knew that they would listen to whatever he told them to do. Oops.
Yeah. So someone answers the question, he has to deal gently with his church, and this was a question somebody's asking, so he has to deal gently with his church, and it was a question based on what she's asking. And she says, no, that's not gentle for a liberal. So if you're a liberal and you're all of a sudden being told what to do, it's not gentle for a liberal. It's gentle for a conservative, because a conservative, as Linda said, is already ready to follow. Liberal people would have found an Elder Jeff incredibly harsh. So why not deal gently? These are back out of the chat as well. Why not deal gently with the liberals and hard with the conservatives at the beginning? And somebody else says, because we wouldn't have joined the liberal movement. So this is back to Elder Tess. Liberals could have joined a liberal movement, but from the beginning, you could have someone like Ivor Myers, kind of for equality. And by the way, Ivor Myers is not the latter rain for the Levites. I just want to put that out there. I won't go into proving it, but he is bad news. And for those of us at Central, we had an experience with him there, and I did watch him for a short period of time too, and really got tired of listening to him because he was so, I don't know the right word. He just seemed so, I want to say rude. I don't know if that's the right word beyond that, but he just, the way he would talk and lay out his questions was always like that he was better than everybody else because he knew something and he left it as some mystery and secret. And so I don't know what she's talking about, bad news, but that was my experience with him. And I knew there was something wrong there. So we could have had a liberal at the very beginning. So talking about 1989, why wasn't there a liberal? And it could have formed a liberal movement because he's dealing with a conservative church. He's dealing with a church that is split. So you've got the Adventism that is split between liberal and conservative. And the conservative wants to follow and do what God says, and a liberal doesn't care what God says. So, so another from the chat says God has to follow his previous habits. And she asked, why does he have that habit? And somebody says majority are conservative, and that depends on where you look, she says. So I want to tell you why he had to choose a conservative. How do conservatives study the Bible in Ellen White? And someone says from the chat, conservatives believe in the spirit of prophecy. That's why he had to choose a conservative, because even though they might misread the words, but we were reading literal to literal, but they believe in the words that they read. And what does a liberal do to the spirit of prophecy? So when you have the subject of trousers, when a conservative reads that, what do? Literal to literal, no proper methodology taken to that. They read the words, they believe them, they apply them. Can God work with that? Yes, he can show them how they're reading those words incorrectly. He can show them that they need to read about dress reform and trousers in a correct fashion, following systematic rules and methodology, because they have shown that they're willing to follow and obey. When a liberal reads Ellen White and she says we cannot wear trousers, what does a liberal do to that? Why do liberals wear trousers? It's not because they understand methodology, because they don't. It's because they simply don't care. Can God work with someone who just doesn't care? No. God can't work with those who are willing to ignore inspiration and instructions. He can't work with those who are willing to ignore good advice and call it bad advice. He's trapped working with a conservative because even though they can read incorrectly, they still read and they still believe that those words are the inspired word of God. So he begins his journey with conservative group, but the conservatives have to be willing to unlearn and learn as well, and learn to read correctly. So a liberal who does not either read at all, a liberal who does not believe that they are the inspired word of this new inspired word of God, A liberal who believes that they can do what is right in their own eyes, God could not work with them, and he cannot work with now. The line of equality takes us from Eden to Eden, where there is perfect equality. There is a curse, and suffering comes in. God has to take us back to Eden, equality. It's the removing of the curse. So there has to be this removing of the curse. So I want to move from the subject of equality and turn this into diet. I wanted to discuss veganism. This is one of the vows. It's one of the moral reforms. You take it to a line, and this was taught in Uganda, and it's been taught since. So many of you may be familiar with it. How did our diet begin? It began vegan. Ellen White says that meat eating was a curse, and an incredible amount of suffering came in. Now that curse has to be removed before the new earth. So you have this removal of suffering. Now it's not about nationality. Now it's about sexism. Now it's about the animal life we were designed to rule and protect and care for. Now that suffering must be removed. God's people cannot participate in it. In the final generation, what are they expected to be? Vegan. So you're going Eden to Eden. They were vegan in the beginning. The curse comes in. And now we're restoring back to Eden, and the curse has to be removed. So if they're vegan in the beginning, they need to be vegan. They are to be vegan in the end. A conservative is a vegan because they read the words literally. Ellen White says they don't say we won't. When a liberal is not vegan, why are they not vegan? They have all the words. Is it because they're applying some type of methodology we don't know about? It's because they don't fundamentally care what God has said. So the liberals don't really care about what the word of God says. So that's the issue with liberalism. It's the fact that they will do what is right in their own eyes. So a conservative, however often they may misread, not always they will obey. Liberalism, the reason they are not vegan is because they fundamentally do not care. Did it somehow go from literal veganism to spiritual veganism? Let me remind you, Ellen White is here. You only had about 150 years. You've had thousands of years between Noah and Ellen White. And did diet somehow go from literal to spiritual in those 5,000 years? And then between Ellen White and us, it went from literal to spiritual. Did equality between men and women, was it literal here? Literal introduction of patriarchal leadership that somehow turned into spiritual patriarchal leadership here? No, it's sexism and it's sexism. It's patriarchy and it's patriarchy. It's veganism and it's veganism. So how that diet looks like on a plate, we may have different foods, depends on what country you're from, depends on what has been grown through that time period. The way the patriarchy might look is different from country to country. It may look slightly different to what it did back then, but the system, the message has not gone from literal to spiritual. It has been an eternal principle. So that is just one reform vow that you can put on a line and see where conservatives and liberals come to different understandings and why. God can work with a conservative that he can teach how to read properly. God could never work with a liberal who simply just doesn't care what the words say. So perfect timing. We'll go through her prayer. Holy God, thank you for our blessings. We see the danger that we are in and how few survive that narrow pathway. How few are attached to the language and the music and the revelry of the world. Lord, how few are willing to leave the baggage behind. I pray, Lord, that we will see over across that chasm, that we will see what this journey is worth, not just for our own salvation, but for the people that we influence. The people inside this movement who are influenced by our words and by our actions. Lord, may we see what the lines teach, even when it comes to reforms. May we see the Lord work that we have in front of the Lord's work that we have in front of us. May no one be lost on our account. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. So I don't know if anybody had questions along the way, but if there were, I missed them because I'm not able to see the chat. So does anybody have any comments? I know that there's a couple spots that I'm still lack on in this area. So if anybody has any comments.
Okay, I'll try.
Okay.
Can you hear me? Yeah. So you touched on the Civil War. I couldn't remember some of that. So the Civil War was a type of revolution, but I think you showed it where she showed the Civil War and then the American Revolution, but I forget how that was. But what I was thinking about was the abortion law, if it gets overturned, right? Which, well, it will. We know that it will get overturned, right? Roe versus Wade. So then that means they're going to give it back to the states. The power will go back to the states the same way that it was during the Civil War when slavery was given to the states to decide. So I was wondering if that's going to be like another Civil War revolution for real that we will see actually happen. It's hard for me on some of these to separate out what is what we're actually going to see and what's kind of, and maybe not the way we think we're going to see it too. So I don't know. Do you know what I mean? Well, because it seems like it's already like the people who are against them overturning it say, we will not go back ever. We will not go back. So you can see this real heated thing coming to a head. Do you think it will get violent like the Civil War?
I don't know if I have your answers, but I know that, you know, what she laid out was that war on the Eastern Front and Western Front both end at Panium, but she says it's not the end of the conflict. So I'm still not able, I don't know if anybody else is better able to understand what that means because we still see it. But I was thinking myself as well about the abortion, because like many of you guys, and not all of you, but definitely like some have admitted, I'm not a person that ever got into politics. I wasn't good on history, any of that stuff. So, and Elder Parmenter had gone over in some studies about the issues of states' rights. And I never quite grabbed all I needed to out of that, but I think I get it by watching this play out with, and somebody correct me if I'm wrong, we're watching this play out with abortion because the Supreme Court is the judicial branch. They're the highest court, they're the highest of the land, and they're only to uphold the laws that Congress then makes, right? So you have all these individual states that are wanting to write their own abortion laws. So if I understand correctly, when they overturn that, and because Alito is the one of the articles that I read, Alito says that he doesn't believe that it should have been in the hands of the Supreme Court to begin with. If I might be poorly saying that, that's what I got out of what I was understanding, that the Supreme Court should not be the one that determines whether or not whether or not abortion is right or wrong. He believes that it should have never gone there and been in the hands of the states, which would mean states' rights. Do I understand that correctly, or does anybody want to correct me on that?
If you're saying that he believes that,
That's how,
go ahead, Susan.
I was just going to agree. That's how I understand it. Go ahead, Christine.
I was just confirming the same thing, that he's putting it back in the hands of the states.
So you put it back in the hands of the states, and we see what many of the states are doing. So you're pitting the states against one another. right?
Yeah.
And at the heart of this pitting the states against one another is going to be tremendous burden on the lives of women.
Yeah.
But they're also pointing at, because they're talking about the 14th Amendment and how the 14th Amendment doesn't mention abortion, but how it was, I don't know if implied is the right word. I think that's the word they might have used, but how it's implied when it comes to the rights of people in their own bodies. And so it should fall under the 14th Amendment, whereas the far right is saying it shouldn't fall under the 14th Amendment because it's not specifically mentioned in the Constitution. But other things that are upheld by the 14th Amendment, besides abortion, are the reproductive rights, the birth control, as well as homosexual marriage, same-sex marriage is not specifically mentioned. So that's why what it's showing is there's a trickle effect of, while when you watched the, what do you call it, the confirmation hearings, and they dodged around that question of Roe v. Wade and gave the implication that they would not do anything about it. And here they are doing something about it. There were some articles on that were really interesting as well, about the two women senators, the Republican senators that voted to confirm those far right judges, knowing what they said, knowing what they were going to do, but thinking, oh, they're not really going to do it. And here they are doing it.
Yeah, Susan Collins said Kavanaugh would he claimed he would never do, overturn Roe versus Wade. Yeah, Elaine.
I have a tough
So
time.
true.
I have no education, and the education that we've gotten from God has been greater than any education we could have gotten, maybe, but I have no education and it seems pretty simple to understand where they were headed. You know what I mean? And but I put that out there as these people that are highly educated. They're senators. They've gone, they're educated, experienced, and we're watching people make some of the stupidest decisions. And looking back and anyway, so I was reading an interesting Twitter thread on all that the other day. So this is going to be a trickle down effect, because the ability for birth control, and then the same-sex marriage, none of that is mentioned in the Constitution or in the 14th Amendment. So the trickle down effect will be all of it undone as we head to the Sunday law, or that is all part of it, my understanding of it. So anyways, going back to the question of the states' rights, then that would be that it takes the judicial branch, takes it out of their hands and puts it into the hands of the states, when the states can then go how they want to go. Somebody was going to say something, I think.
No, you've said it really well. I wish I could explain it that well. Yeah. So we could see civil war. They're also saying they can use the phones, our telephones. I was just reading an article on that, tracing you to abortion clinics, some way that they, and it made me think of the Fugitive Slave Law Act, how if you tried to hide somebody from that, or not give them back, right? If you were to go against that Sunday law in that time, I can just see a lot of similarities. I can't express it like you can, Elaine, but I can see the similarities. Like if we were to try and keep someone safe, we would be doing the same thing that they were trying to do back in the slave time, if they were trying to keep a slave safe and not send them back.
Exactly. I was thinking.
Anyhow, 14th Amendment. It's the Passover, because the 14th was the Passover. So you can see that the Passover is before the cross. Isn't the cross also a Sunday law, Waymark? I know 2019 was, right? 2019 was a cross, right?
I think that's old thinking, but I'll leave it at that. I'm pretty sure that's old thinking. The cross was 2019 when you take it to
Yeah, 2019. So Sunday, anyway, I'm
Sunday
just trying to put it onto the big line now.
Yeah, Sunday law, because I was thinking
Go ahead.
I was thinking about that a while back, because Sunday law is 1850, which I think you said
Yeah.
Fugitive Slave Act. So yeah, I don't know what that's gonna look like. I only know what it looked like then. And back then you had the abolitionists that were now under law, because you know there's not going to be any specific law. So I don't know what it's going to look like for us. But you had the abolitionists then that now is required by a law to return a slave to their owner. So I don't know again, what it looks like for us, but when we're standing up for equality and the rights of people at some point in time, does that mean that we go, we have to do some sort of against the law? So I don't know what it looks like. I'm sure that we'll know more and more as we go forward, but 1850 definitely is the waymark of Sunday law.
Yeah.
I got a feeling that we will head towards violence.
They already kind of showed us that January 6th. They showed us what they're capable of.
Well, just even what the justices did, the Supreme Court justices, they already had made up their mind, but when they leaked the emails or whatever got leaked out, they were just going to sit on it until everything went by, and then they wouldn't have to hear any backlash or anything. But now that it's leaked out, now they're getting the onslaught from all directions, and now they're sniveling because somebody leaked it, and the people are coming up, are protesting against it. And I guess bottom line, they don't, from what they're doing is they don't have the people's, they don't have the people's
Support.
Yeah, well, not the support, but they don't have the they're not doing good in
Best
their
interest, the best interest of the people.
right. They're not having the people's best interest, and then they're trying to relieve themselves or recluse themselves from that by saying, "Oh, we should have never had this before us," which is I don't know, kind of wishy-washy if you ask me. Because it's important. Obviously, it's important to a lot of people, or else we wouldn't have citizens on the streets. And even the opinion polls tell you that more people support abortion rights than are against it, and that should be some kind of I don't know, telling them that they should be doing what the people want and not what their opinions.
And so what did Alito say to that this morning? Or was it Alito? Was it Alito? No, it's Clarence Thomas. What did Clarence Thomas say to that this morning? We read the articles.
That we won't be bullied.
We won't be bullied.
Well, maybe, I don't know. I think he should be removed just because of what happened between his wife and him. He should be just straight up removed. And I think that's going to play into this whole violence thing too. It's all those little things that the Republicans Party are doing.
So if 2019, if the impeachment of Donald Trump, and then following that, the Senate didn't I don't remember the terminology. Maybe somebody remembers the terminology. He is impeached, but he was not removed from office because the Senate wouldn't vote for that.
Yeah.
So if that empowered the dictator, what does this, and it gives it's less restrained, right? The dictator is less restrained. What does it do when the Supreme Court goes against the will of the people?
It increases the dictator even more.
It increases the dictator's power, because even though he's not in power, what he wanted is what's taking place.
What's the trickle-down effect of increasing the dictator's power? What about his people, his followers?
They have more power to enforce their beliefs on everyone else.
And they're more emboldened. So they're more emboldened now than they even were January 6th.
Right.
So it almost has to come to violence, almost,
That's what it seems like.
because if you're speaking out as a citizen and the courts are not hearing you and your government's not hearing you and your votes don't even matter, so what do you got left?
And it's interesting because how did they get to the place that they're at? Because they cried those same things, didn't they?
Yeah, exactly.
That's interesting.
Because of the shoe was on the other foot kind of thing.
Susan put justice has fallen in the street. Yeah, because they were crying the same thing.
We also have to remember what Elder Tess and Elder Perman have been telling us, that it's not going to be like war. Well, I guess war against, maybe I'm thinking wrong, because I'm thinking maybe the king of the north, king of the south, and we're on our, so it could be stuff here. I don't know, but she's always like said it's going to be skirmishes because it's information war.
Yeah. Yeah.
That there will be violence. I mean, there already is. We already are in civil war
Right.
when it comes to information and little terrorism attacks and stuff like that. You know, people driving their cars into protests and stuff. That's violence. That's war against the other side.
Yeah.
Just right there.
It's really interesting, and it'd be interesting to see how it proceeds, because we don't really fully know what it's going to look like.